our contact info will be on here as well. But I'm really excited about this one, and I think the next slide here, Zach, is our info. But so what we need everybody to do, as per the state's request, is we have to be able to log all the attendees. So if you would not mind going into the chat box, which is on that toolbar there, you can see the arrows, and I already put in my information as an example, but we just need last name, first name, license number, and email. And that way we will be able to take record of it and be able to do the quiz. And then at the end of the quiz, so assuming everybody passes with flying colors, you'll get your certificate of attendance that you can hold for submitting to the state or for your records. And then also for GCSAA credits for any superintendents out there, you just need to go to the GCSAA website, and Zach has all the information at the end of the presentation, so you can write all that stuff down as well. And so
make sure when you're Cam, make sure when you're entering your information, separate it with commas this time. Last time we tried soft returns, which didn't work very well. So yeah, just last comma, first comma, and so on. Appreciate that.
Yep. Thank you very much. All right, and like I said, if you have anybody that wasn't able to join us, this is being recorded, so please reach out to either myself or Gordon Vosti. You can bug Zach too; I'm sure he'd love it. But we'd be happy to forward on the quiz, assuming that they are able to watch this. So, without further ado, I will pass it off to our Green Solutions extraordinaire, Dr. Zach Riker, who has the pleasure of introducing a great speaker for us today.
Thanks, folks, for joining us. We really appreciate it. Taking a little bit of your time today, and appreciate all the support you give to Bear and certainly to Cameron Smith and Gordon Vosti out in the California region. So thrilled today to have Dr. Jim Murphy from Rutgers University. And Jim is a good friend of mine. Actually, he's upstairs right now, to be honest. And Jim has been working in turf for about, I'm not even going to say 25, 30 years. And most recently has been spending a lot of time working on the cultural practices surrounding summer stress, including anthracnose, which anybody who's growing POA annual knows it's one of the worst diseases. And so without further ado, I'm going to, Jim, I'm just going to turn it over to you if you want to share your screen and have at it, and then I'll mute. And folks, if you have questions, and please ask questions, you can either ask questions in the chat box, which is the little button that you just filled out to fill your name and California license number. You can ask questions there, or if you want to unmute yourself, we're happy to let you all do that too. And so if you would ask questions during during Jim's presentation. And Jim, are you sharing your screen? Dr. Murphy? Dr. Murphy?
You better run upstairs.
Dr. Murphy? Hang on, I am going to run upstairs.
Stand by, everyone. I didn't think we'd have technical difficulties when they were in the same household.
Cam, you can go ahead, and I'll figure out what's going on with Jim.
I need to have James do a guitar interlude. All right, we'll stand by, everyone.
A priest, a nun, and a rabbi walk into a bar.
Oh, there we go. Doug McCullen's been working on a 5-minute set for everyone.
Getting closer. Getting closer.
Doug, why do I feel like you can't finish that joke?
Hey, Jim, are you in?
You know me too well.
Okay, Jim's not back in. Okay, oh, there's Jim's waiting in the lobby.
It's always good.
Yeah, he was just here a second ago.
I know. We saw his presentation and everything.
Yeah.
Hey, am I back in, Zach?
You're in back. You know, we're just monitoring you, Jim. We're and so go ahead. You can share your screen if you can.
Okay, I will try to do that again.
There you go. It's working, Jim.
Is that coming through?
Yep, slowly. There you go. Gotta love technology. Appreciate everybody's patience. And so, Jim, if you want to go to the presentation mode in PowerPoint, and we will just turn it over to you, buddy.
All right, great, Zach. So I'm coming through. You can hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Zach, for inviting me to participate in your California Sunshine Series. As Zach mentioned, I'll be talking about cool season management, or management of cool season grass during summer stress. And the model we're going to talk about today is Anthracnose on annual bluegrass. And I need to acknowledge a bunch of people who have worked with me on this project. My colleague Bruce Clark at Rutgers University, and we've had a host of wonderful graduate students who are now PhDs and masters recipients that have worked on this project, done a wonderful job. Their names are on the screen here. Many have now gone on to bigger and better things in their careers, and certainly want to acknowledge John Iguajato, Joe Roberts, Chad Schmid, James Hempling, Rennie Wang, and Kyle Genova on this work as well. This work that we're going to summarize very briefly for you has been conducted for many years, since the early 2000s. I think some of the first work Bruce and I did dated back to 2001. It's been summarized in a number of trade journal articles in golf course management. So if you
Hey, Jim, are you still there? Dr. Murphy.
Yep, I'm here. Zach, can you hear me?
Yeah, it just cut out for a little bit. I think somebody, if anybody's controlling it, please don't mute all, folks, when you people come in. Thank you. I think somebody just muted all. Go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
No problem, because I saw the connection kind of got goofy for me here. All right. So as I mentioned, we're dealing with the stress indicator of anthracnose on annual bluegrass. Here's a picture of it chewing away at the turf. Here's a more advanced symptoms where the grass is deteriorating as a result of the disease. And this disease is definitely intensified by stress. If the disease gets down in the crown region, as you see in this photo here, it starts to really damage the plant to the point of actually killing it, not just thinning it out. And the basal rot stage is typically much more severe than the foliar blight stage of this disease. Here's just a close-up of the cerevili on the leaves with hair-like structures that project off the cerevili. And so these are signs that you have anthracnose active in the turf. And if you like to look at things microscopically, here are the conidia that you'll see under a microscope that is the spreading phase of the organism. This is how it gets spread about the turf and infects more plants. So on to what we really want to talk about, which is the cultural strategies for anthracnose. How do you manage the stress in the turf so that you get less of this disease? Again, we're using anthracnose as a model to indicate when stresses are high, and you'll see more anthracnose. And our work, just summarized very briefly in this slide here, has found that plant deficiencies in things like nitrogen and potassium, ultra low mowing, thatch formation, excessively wet, or on the other side of the spectrum, very dry irrigation are stresses that all tend to increase the risk of damage from anthracnose. And so let's talk about some of the details of these things. Start off simply with mowing height. Here's some work that John Inguagiato did back in the early 2000s looking at mowing. And again, a lot of these things are not going to completely control the disease, but you can see the intensity of the stress is much greater on the right side where we're mowing at 0.11 inch versus on the left, the outline plot is getting mowed at 0.14 inch. Neither plot is free of anthracnose, but you can see the severity is much different just based on a basic fundamental practice of mowing. Here's some work that Chad Schmid did looking at fertility. Poa annua is, I like to call Poa annua as sort of a nutrient hog. It needs a fair amount of fertility to grow well. And so you want to make sure that your fertility is optimized for your conditions. And if it gets too lean, Poa annua is really going to struggle. And what you're seeing here are 4 different fertility programs. 0 on the upper left part of the slide, 3/8 of a pound monthly. On the upper right, the lower left is 7/10 of a pound, where we're applying nitrogen every 2 weeks. The 7/10 of a pound is the annual rate. And then in the lower right quadrant of the series of pictures, we have an annual program that gives you 1.5 pounds. All these different annual rates that are summarized just above the plot are achieved by applying it nitrogen either monthly, every 2 weeks, or every week. And then the rate of nitrogen application is up here at the top of the slide. And it's just under 1/10 of a pound was applied in this work. And the thinning, the discoloration that you see in this 0 slide is all being caused by anthracnose. And as you apply more nitrogen, you obviously see the symptoms dissipate. And you would argue that the symptoms that you see in this 1.5 pound annual program with weekly N through the growing season certainly has some anthracnose in it, but it's certainly much more tolerable. And in some cases, probably don't really require much of a fungicide program to suppress the disease. So nitrogen is clearly a very effective management tool. Obviously, you have other considerations that you need to think about in your program regarding how much N you want to apply, but recognize that if you're being very stingy with nitrogen, you're putting Poa annua under much greater stress. John Inguagiato did some further work looking at trying to determine whether or not you could find a critical leaf tissue value for nitrogen in the plant. And here's some of his work that shows for this data set a critical value of 3.6. So if you look at this red line here, as you increase the nitrogen in the clippings, the disease goes way, way down. And then at some point, further increases in nitrogen content don't have much of an impact. And this little elbow in this graph basically lines up with a 3.6% value in the leaf tissue. I think this is just a little bit of John's data. I think when he looked at all of his data, he came up with a ultimate recommendation of a critical value around 3.4% nitrogen in.
Oh, Dr. Murphy? Jim. I think you're cutting out a little bit. Hang on. Jim, are you hearing him?
Negative.
Okay. Okay.
Is he walking around on your deck?
Oh, I don't think so. Let me let's see. I'll get back up there. Is he still in the meeting? He's still in. He's still in, which is good. Okay.
This is going to be an interesting recording for whoever gets to watch this later.
Go downstairs closer to the internet.
We're picking up his mic, Zach. That's good news.
You can hear me, Cameron?
Yep.
He's getting closer. He's getting closer to the internet.
Yeah. Bad internet, man. It follows you everywhere, Zach.
I know.
Could you switch from dial-up already? Sorry, everybody.
All right. Location where the. Am I back on?
You're back on, Jim.
Great.
Split
Sorry,
fuck
the world
potassium.
of technology is raising its ugly. So I need to get back to my PowerPoint here. All right. So to what degree did you guys hear this part about the leaf tissue?
I did not. We were on that.
Yeah, I think we heard it all the way up until John using his entire data set to reach a 3.4% critical value.
Yep. Yeah, and so what I was saying beyond that then was as you go below that value on this red line, you get down around 3% in the leaf tissue. The disease potential gets very, very severe. And we would interpret it that, at that leaf percentage, there's a lot of stress in the plant, and that would be a potential indicator you could use if you're willing to do tissue testing to look at nitrogen content in your plant. So I'll switch over to some potassium work then. This is some work that Chaz Schmid did. He looked at potassium rate. He also looked at some potassium sources to see whether or not this was a potential for influencing anthracnose or stress in the plant. And here's some data from Chaz, looking at all the different fertilization materials, the sources that are outlined up here in the upper left. KCl is potassium chloride, this K2SO4 is potassium sulfate. He also looked at potassium carbonate, which is a component in some, not all, but some liquid fertilizers. And then the fourth material that had potassium in it that he looked at was actually a combination of potassium and nitrogen in the nitrate form. And the take-home message here is all these colored lines are significantly lower than the dashed black line up at the top, which means that all these potassium sources were effective at reducing the level of anthracnose when applied to the turf. The red line, again, if you look at the legend, is potassium chloride. It was not quite as effective as the other three sources. We were never quite sure exactly why that was. I don't think it's terribly important, but because it was effective at reducing the anthracnose, just not quite as effective as the other three. I don't think you need to be scared of potassium chloride. Some people like to avoid it because it tends to be a little bit saltier material in the spray solution. And perhaps that is playing a role with anthracnose. We're not 100% sure. But some people try to avoid it because of the foliar burn potential that chloride might have in that spray solution. So essentially, there were no differences in these lower three sources. All worked quite well. When Chaz looked at the rate, and I apologize, these are actually in metric, and that's not the most helpful. Oh, I have an overwrite there, so I corrected that. Just had to click on my slide. So the potassium rates that Chaz looked at were annual. These are the annual rates. He applied it every 2 weeks and much slower doses throughout the growing season. But the total that he applied annually ranged from 1.3 pounds potash up to 5.4 pounds of potash per thousand. And those three rates of potassium are all on top of each other. If you look at the three lines at the bottom of the graph, those are the three rates. There's no statistical differences there, except for maybe right here early on where the lower or the higher rate was technically a little less successful, but I'm not sure that's biologically meaningful, especially when you see all the rest of the dates where we just don't see much of a difference in the rates. So the take-home message here is potassium is important, but you don't necessarily need to apply a ton to get the benefits of potassium. So the 1.3 pounds was just as effective as the 5.4. The important thing here is just don't be deficient in potassium or so low that you start to stress out the plant. Just to give you a visual of how effective, this happens to be the highest rate. And again, here's the plot showing fairly good turf performance. There is anthracnose in here if you get up close and look. But if you compare it off to the side here where this is a non-potassium treated area, you can see the very dramatic difference between no potassium versus potassium being applied in the turf. And again, the 1.3 pound, I don't have a picture of it here, but it was just as effective as this 5.4 pounds annually. So make sure that your potassium programs are adequate and not starving the turf for potassium. Otherwise, you're adding stress to the plant, and anthracnose is a disease that really thrives on stressed out turf. An important thing to recognize in Chaz's work is it took us a little while. It took us several years to really figure out what was going on that led up to this potassium work. And we were confused by the way we were sampling. So a message here is to understand your root zone. Where is it located? And in poannular turf, it's often located in this upper inch or two of the profile. And that was the case in Chaz's work. We had very few roots that would go down into this underlying soil area. We had a classical push-up style construction, and this root zone here is a sandy loam material, and it actually contains a fair amount of potassium in it. Whereas up here, this is the top dress zone that has built up over many, many years of growing this turf. You can actually see there's a band of organic matter in here where we obviously got a little lackadaisical with top dressing. But the point I'm really want you to focus on is this zone here is sand mixed with the thatch of the grass. There is really very little clay or any other fine material in there besides organic matter. And this behaves much like a sand-based root zone. It has a bit more nutrient retention capacity than straight sand because of the organic matter in it, but it's far different than the soil that underlies it. And initially we were sampling the whole 6 to 7 inches of the profile, which is a classical soil sampling technique. And not until we focused on sampling this upper part of the profile did we start to see what the plant was actually seeing in terms of nutrition. And so it was very important in Chaz's work to separate out this top dress zone that I've labeled here as matte in this picture versus the underlying soil. If you take the time to separate these two zones and test them separately, you'll see in a situation like this, the nutrient values up here are far different than the nutrient values that you get in the soil below. And this is really what the plant is saying, where the root zone is. So it's important when you're doing soil testing to make sure you're sampling only the root zone that the plant is growing in, because if the area outside of the root zone is dramatically different, you're going to bias your soil test results. And in our case, what we would see if we would include this in our soil test is a much higher potassium level than because of all the potassium down here that the plant just doesn't see because it doesn't have a root system growing down in this layer. When Chaz started looking at soil test as well as tissue test, trying to see whether or not he could identify critical levels, when he looked at the soil test for that mat layer that I just described, his data showed that once you got down around 50 parts per million, this is where you started to see real intensification of the anthracnose. So the vertical axis here represents how much disease. So these data points up here in this quadrant are very stressed out plants with a lot of disease. And then once you kind of cross over into this category that's 50 and above, in that mat layer, there is a much less disease. And it also shows that going up well above 100 into 150 really didn't pay much value to your suppression of the disease. So you just had to get above this critical level of 50, and you started to see the plants were less stressed out and a lot less anthracnose. When Chaz looked at the tissue testing, what he found was another similar kind of relationship. You had this population of really stressed out anthracnose-ridden plants versus a population of plots where you had much less disease, and that cutoff point happened to be around 2%. This is in metric units, grams per kilogram, but that equates to basically a 2% potassium in the leaf tissue in his test. So you had a lot of disease. Above that, you had much less disease. In Chaz's work, he showed he would get a maximum of about 3% potassium in the leaf tissue, and it took a soil test level of about 100 parts per million to see about 3%. Another thing that Chaz looked at, and we're still working on this issue because this was turns out to be a lot more difficult to manipulate experimentally than we expected. But the issue of for us in the region, we can control pH fairly well, not as well as we thought, but you can allow soils in our region to get quite acidic if you don't lime. And so if you have naturally high soil pHs, which I'm assuming many of you in California do, this may not be as impertinent, but I think it's helpful to you to recognize that higher soil pHs are much less stressful on Poa annua than low pHs are. So in our work, we're seeing pHs that are in the sixes, especially up around 6.4, 6.5. And that's what you see in this plot. All these plots that are much greener are pHs in the sixes. All these plots that are yellow and chlorotic and not healing, well, none of them are healing particularly well at this point because they've just been aerified. These are aerified plots. But the color is a strong indicator of very low pHs down in the fives. We have plots that are measuring 5.2, 5.1. So the higher pHs are much better because the plants, at least for Poa annua.
I think we lost him again.
We lost him. Okay, hang on just a second.
Am I back in? It kicked me out momentarily.
Jim, are you back?
I can hear you, Zach. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back in. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry for the technological glitch. Want to switch into the topic of sand top dressing related to stress. Obviously, we're doing this practice to modify thatch and soil, smooth surface, protect the crown. For those of you in colder climates, you're probably doing it for winter protection. This is some work that a number of graduates but essentially the work that we've done shows that much to the opposite of what we thought when we started this work, top dressing practices are very beneficial. They take a lot of stress off the plant. Now, applying the material and working it in is obviously stressful, so you got to be careful about how you'll make the application. But once you get the top dressing applied, it's a very beneficial thing to the plant. And Johnny Guajato started this work back in the early 2000s, and he used some fairly aggressive programs, and he found that anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds per 1,000 square feet every 7 to 10 days was ultimately very beneficial. Joe Roberts looked at this from the standpoint of traffic. He applied similar top dressing rates, and he actually put foot traffic on his plots with students who wore golf shoes to simulate foot traffic on putting greens. And he found that obviously you had a little bit of foot traffic damage, but it did not intensify the disease, which is, again, something we didn't necessarily expect. A lot of this research was very counter to what our initial hypotheses were, that things like top dressing and traffic were going to intensify this disease. And we found that it really does not. And because of this, Bruce Clark and I are often no longer talking about wounding causing anthracnose. We are not 100% sure that the typical wounding of a well-done anthracnose or a top dressing program really contributes a lot to anthracnose disease. You have to wound it pretty aggressively, and that's some work that James Hempling did looking at cultivation practices. If you're not damaging the turf in a very aggressive way, you're being very light and gentle. These practices in our research really never stressed out the plants enough to intensify anthracnose. All bets are off, of course, if you go out and do something really radical and real aggressive, but I don't think typically most superintendents are going to be wanting to do those types of practices in the middle of the growing season. The benefits of sand would try to illustrate here in this picture. On the left is a core taken from a plot that receives no top dressing. The little black line that showed up there on that image is showing you the approximate locations of the crowns of the plant, and we all know how important the crowns of the plant are. Those are the parts of the plant that you must keep alive. If you lose the crown, you have completely dead turf. You don't just have loss of leaf tissue, you have loss of the potential to regrow new leaves. So protecting the crowns is critical. And then over here on the right, you see this is taken from a plot that's been top dressed. You can see all the sand that's been incorporated. And you can see the crown location is roughly this black line here. And then you can see the sheath that's developing out of the crown is much larger and much advanced there, sorry. The sheath is much larger, it's whiter, healthier looking. And so you can see any kind of you can see visually the health of the plant of this core on the right is much different than what you see over here on the left. And then because of the precarious location of the crowns being very surface oriented, you could easily see how scalping damage could be much more severe and less likely to recover, or certainly slower to recover on turf that's maintained where the crown is close to the surface versus over here. If you scalp this turf, not that you would ever want to do that, but if it ever did happen, you've got a nice healthy crown to reshoot and grow new roots. So again, this is a great picture because it physically shows you the healthiness of the turf with top dressing. And so the trick for you as a superintendent is how do you get this top dressing put out there often enough and at high enough rates to produce this kind of conditioning and maintain that through the growing season. And therein lies the challenge of that practice. So as we've mentioned, there's a number of cultural strategies already that we've talked about, but we've studied those practices from the standpoint of them by themselves. And so low nitrogen, low K, ultra low mowing, and thatch are critical stress factors that you want to try to manage to stress out the grass or not stress out the grass, and then thereby keep the risk of anthracnose damage to a minimum. But we haven't studied these practices until fairly recently in combinations and scientific refer to practices together. Themselves, we know these practices when you, and so that's some work that James Hempfling did as a graduate student for us, looking at things like mowing height, nitrogen fertility, and top dressing sand. And these are the levels that he studied. He studied a mowing height as low as 0.09 on the bench setting and 0.125. Fertility practices were as low as 2 pounds and as high as 4.1 pounds. That was an annual program with much of it just spaced out in very light, frequent applications through the growing season. And then he looked at a couple of top dressing programs, a very minimalistic program where he only occasionally did it versus he did it routinely every couple of weeks. And it also included some fairly heavy top dressing practice applications in the spring and the fall. So just to jump into the data right away, summarizing the data from 2014, but this was indicative of all the years that James looked at it. And all the various combinations are summarized over here on the left, upper left with a legend. So let's quickly kind of go through it. This first column of information is referring to the nitrogen program that James applied to the turf. And the 4 treatments summarized at the top are all low nitrogen, and then these lower 4 are all high nitrogen. The middle column here represents the mowing program. So the first 2 at the top are low mowing, the next 2 are high, the next 2 are low, and then the last 2 on the bottom are high mowing. And then over here on the right is the sand top dressing program, low, high, low, high, low, high, low, high. And so you can see this legend is roughly organized as they are ranked over here in the data. If you look at this upper line, which is a dashed line in red, and you look at the legend, that's the practice, the mowing, the best management combination. I shouldn't say best management. This is actually, there are no best management practices in terms of stress. There's very low nitrogen in that program, very low mowing, and very little sand applied, and it has the most severe anthracnose. So it's the most stressed out turf. And if you then simply add to that, well, before we get into that, if you look then at the lower part of the graph, I've just drawn a dashed blue line through it, and it lines up with a 10% anthracnose level. This is a level of anthracnose that's very tolerable. I mean, obviously nobody wants any anthracnose in their turf, but it's such a low level of anthracnose that it's a livable amount of anthracnose in the turf. And we were able to basically maintain a 10% level of disease in this particular year just with cultural practices. And this blue area is pointing up to the bottom of the legend, which is high nitrogen, high mowing and a high sand top dressing program, that treatment in this particular year never exceeded 10% disease. And that's a combination of all the best management practices. So as you can see in this graph, as you build up practices, you get more and more disease suppression. So let's talk about the individual kind of components. This dashed red line versus this line that's also red. Essentially, that's going from no best management practices and adding the best management practice of more sand. If you look at that black line that's dashed, that's adding to the non-BMP program, the practice of a little bit higher mowing. So whether you add sand or adjust your mowing height to increase it, that's sort of the change in disease that you get with either of those two practices. If you add more sand and increase your mowing height, this line here, which is a solid black line, represents the next increment in improved stress management and less anthracnose. And then if you look at these four lines down at the bottom, these are all the treatments that have a component of more nitrogen. So nitrogen is the most powerful management tool that you have to manipulate the stress level in PO annua. It has the single greatest effect of all the practices, but obviously as you're adding things like increased mowing or more sand top dressing, they play a role, just not quite as impactful as the nitrogen. And this was very enlightening to us because this helps us with recommendations for what you can do as a manager to manipulate playing conditions without overstressing your grass. And this data essentially is telling us here that if you have to adjust any practices to improve playability, lowering the mowing height was probably going to be much more impactful for play, but not as great a impact on disease severity, as opposed to adjusting your nitrogen program. If you adjust your nitrogen program, you're going to have a really significant impact on disease, and in a bad way if you lower it. Here's just a picture showing you the effects under low mowing, the impact of top dressing. Over here on the right is the top dressing program that's applying very little sand. It is getting top dressed, but it's not getting very many. I think it's only a couple light top dressings in the summer and basically some heavy top dressings in the spring and the fall, but nothing else. Whereas this plot here on the left is receiving regular routine top dressing throughout the growing season every 2 weeks, and hence a much higher application rate of sand compared to over here on the right. And so what you're visualizing here in this slide is simply the practice of top dressing throughout the year. If you don't top dress throughout the year, you're stressing out the plant, versus over here on the left where you are top dressing and the plant is seeing less stress. Here's some data on playability, looking at the combination of all these different practices: low mowing, higher fertility, lower fertility. In this particular slide, practice in the higher level is coded BM instead of high. And what you see a ball roll within the range of, in this column here, I'm pointing a 8.5 to 9.5 foot ball roll with a stimp meter. And over here on the far right, anything above 12.5 shows up as a percentage, or a 0 if it never happened. And as you would expect, lower mowing has a great impact. You can see that the percentage of time over 9.5 foot ball rolls is well into the 90s for all the treatment combinations. There aren't a lot of big differences here with all the different fertility and top dressing practices. There's some minor differences in terms of how impactful these are compared to what I'm going to show you at a much higher height of cut in a little. So here, height the time you see ball rolls above 9.5 feet. A lot of courses in my region are wanting a minimum of 10 foot. More likely, many courses are looking at 11 or 12 foot, some even higher than that. So hence why we picked, 9.5 feet as sort of a cutoff point to show you here. And you can see, maybe with, low fertility and more frequent top dressing, you're getting up around 3/4 of the time it's above 10 feet. Over here on the left are the actual 1 foot range increments, percentages. If you look at the mean ball roll distance for low mowing height, it's around 11 foot or more with the various practices, and with the higher mowing, you basically drop into that 10-foot range on average. If you look at the low fertility impact at this low mowing, you can see you're in the 11.2 to 11.5 range. You jump into a little bit higher fertility, and you can see you can have a small impact. It's less than 1/2 foot. It's probably not that big of a deal compared to what a golfer can sense. Doug Karcher did some work years ago showing that golfers can't perceive anything less than a 1/2 foot difference in stimp meter readings. So if you're within a 1/2 foot change, it's probably not perceptible to the golfer. And you can see under low mowing heights, the change with the various practices is, like I said, less than a 1/2 foot. So it's statistically meaningful? Yes, but biologically to the golfer, it's probably not that big a deal. And to me, would be very useful to me as a manager to know that manipulating your fertility levels under a very low height of cut have a relatively small impact on ball roll is pretty insightful to me. Whereas when you shift to the best management practice of high mowing and look at the fertility impacts, you can start seeing that the ball roll effects are now approaching a 1/2 foot. And it's starting to get into that dicey range of, are the golfers noticing it? And there's a good likelihood that on some days, certainly they're going to detect a difference. So again, this is important, going back to that previous slide, that mowing height is not that impactful compared to nitrogen in terms of anthracnose severity, but it is impactful on the ball roll. And so it's one of those kind of trade-offs, trying to find the sweet spot for your management program. So combinations of best management practices. The most effective thing is if you put all three of these things together, you're going to have tremendous impact on stress in reducing it, and therefore reduce anthracnose. You could potentially get to levels some years where you don't even have to focus your fungicide program on anthracnose, but that isn't necessarily going to happen in every year. So we're not advocating that people not use fungicides to control anthracnose. We're just reporting that some years it may be that effective. Light frequent top dressing was most beneficial under the low mowing program and low nitrogen fertility. This is not something I would have expected in doing this work. It's a little counterintuitive, but if you're going to use either low mowing or low fertilization, the message here is don't skip your top dressing. I think some people intuitively think that maybe since they're mowing lower and using lower fertility, they don't have to top dress as much, but our work shows that that's really not true. You're going to get tremendous impact from that. James also looked at combining these best management practices to look at fungicide efficacy. And the message here that we're going to get to is this is really quite impactful. And he was able to document that you can actually reduce your fungicide inputs significantly and maintain excellent turf performance and disease suppression if you're using BMPs to keep the stress level in the turf down. So again, he looked at these two mowing heights of 0.09 and 1/8 of an inch. He used a couple pounds of N versus 4 pounds of N. And then he looked at a bunch of different fungicide programs that were designed to look at how limited amount of fungicide could you use and still suppress the disease. Took two approaches here. One is a calendar approach where fungicides were applied every 14 days, and he adjusted the rate of using the label maximum 100% versus 75% of the label, 50% of the label, and 25% of the label. The fungicides combination he chose to use in this were basically chlorothalonil and phosphatyl aluminum, or Signature and Daconil, the product names there. And you can see the rates. The second approach to looking at fungicide inputs was threshold based. And the way James did this is we picked a 5%, trying to keep the disease no more than 10%. So whenever he went out and saw that there was about 5% of active anthracnose, he went out and made a spray at 100% fungicide rate using, again, this Daconil Signature combination in an effort to arrest the disease at 5% and hopefully not have it get above 10% in the plots. So those were the two methods of trying to get so here's data from 2012, which is very similar to other years. The red line here, and the blue line represents the high nitrogen fertility program. So right away, what you can see is that the red line, where you're applying less nitrogen, always had more anthracnose. It didn't matter what the fungicide program was. It was always higher amount of disease compared to the blue line, which represents the plots under a higher nitrogen fertility program. So it's important to recognize, if you choose to manage turf under low nitrogen, you're always going to have poor disease control. You may have adequate disease control, but it's always going to be poor if the turf is further stressed out under a low nitrogen fertility program. Then if you look at the data points along these lines, what you see under low nitrogen, this is where no fungicide was applied. This is the 25% Daconil Signature program. This is a 50% label rate, 75 and 100%. And you can see to get down close to 10%, you had to be at least at 50%. And to get below 10%, you had to be at 75 or 100% of that fungicide combination to get that level of disease control. Whereas to get to 10% under the high nitrogen program, all you had to do is do the 25% label rate program, and you can get the disease down under 10%. And then obviously you got a little bit better disease control, but significantly you didn't really need to go above 50% to get something that was statistically comparable to the 100% rate if you were treating the plots with what we called a high nitrogen program, or a BMP level of nitrogen. In terms of the threshold program, what really the best data that came out of that was we could easily show you the impact of best management practices on how much fungicide was required based on the number of applications. So this chart that James put together is showing you the total number of applications under these program combinations. So this cell here is showing 9 applications. And this to keep that disease under control with the threshold program. Very similar number of applications, exactly the same for this data.
Hey, Jim, I think it cut out again. Dr. Murphy?
Mowing. Low nitrogen.
Cam, do you hear him at all?
Nope, don't hear him.
Okay, his headphones, I think, are going bad fast. Hang on.
It says I'm back in. It says I'm back in. Can you hear me again? Cameron, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I didn't hear any of your you're talking on that slide though. So if you want to go over the fungicide part.
Okay, I think I'm back in then. And if you didn't hear any of this, I apologize. I'll go through it again. This chart is showing the number of applications. This happens to be the data set for 2012, looking at, again, the number of applications for the various programs that we were looking at. And the statistics showed us that it really came down to what you were doing with mowing versus nitrogen that was driving how many threshold applications were required during the growing season. So this row here represents the low nitrogen program. And you can see it didn't matter what mowing height we were looking at. It required 9 applications throughout the 2012 to suppress the disease. Now, where it made a difference, obviously, is if you switched into the high nitrogen program, and you could start seeing significant reductions in how many fungicide applications were required. And in the case of the low mowing combined with high nitrogen, it took 5 applications to suppress the disease that year. And then if you switched to high mowing, you could get away with as few as 2 applications during the growing season to suppress anthracnose. So the fungicide savings were pretty tremendous. And if you compared these threshold programs to the calendar-based program, which resulted in 10 applications per year, this combination that shows low nitrogen under both low and high nitrogen, that was a 10% savings in how much was applied based to a calendar-based program. And then high nitrogen combined with low mowing was a 50% reduction. And then the combination of high nitrogen and high mowing resulted in an 80% reduction in fungicides based on a comparison to the calendar-based program of 10 applications. So these management practices that affect stress of the plant are very, very critical in what you have to end up doing as a manager to mitigate stress-related problems like anthracnose. So the take-home message is you need your management practices to enhance. Lowering the mowing height, as long as you can keep your nitrogen program adequate, is very feasible in my mind. It will intensify the disease some, but as long as the nitrogen isn't also reduced, you can get away with that. And again, John Inguagiato's research shows that something like 3.4, 3.5, maybe as high as 3.6 is sort of that sweet spot, if you will, for suppressing anthracnose. And also continue your top dressing program. If you can do that, you could probably achieve the green speeds you want without overly stressing out the plant to the point where things kind of spiral out of control on you. And also, as we just talked about, fungicide efficacy is going to be much better, and you could actually reduce your input somewhat. And in an extreme situation, we showed you could reduce by 80. I guarantee that it's going to work that well for everybody, but I think you can take a lot of stress off your fungicide program by implementing be higher nitrogen program will pay dividends for you. Some other practices, very quick. We don't want to take forever to get through all this stuff, so I'm going to not show a lot of data, but I will see with other practices. With irrigation, it's been well known for a long time that excessively wet conditions will bring on anthracnose. But Joe Roberts' research showed clearly that if you stress out the plant by letting it wilt, that's going to bring on expression of anthracnose as well. So you want to try to avoid wilt stress conditions as much as possible. I know we all want firm, fast putting greens, and I love them as much as anybody else do. But you have to work hard at avoiding it, letting it go into strong wilt, because wilt is too much stress. Dry conditions are great, but you certainly want to try to avoid letting the grass wilt out and stimulating anthracnose. Joe Roberts actually used ET to schedule his irrigation, and he showed ET at 80% of reference ET was enough to avoid that kind of wilt stress. And if you got below 60% ET and couldn't timely hand water to keep it from wilting, the wilt stress would really come on in that kind of irrigation program and result in more anthracnose. So if you want to go lower than 80% because you're trying to maintain drier conditions, that will work, but only if you can adequately hand water to the point of not allowing wilt stress to show up frequently and for extended periods of time. James Hempflin looked at verticutting, and he was able to document that very aggressive verticutting, very close spacings, very deep where you're wounding the crowns, can slightly increase the disease. But if you're just doing more normal, kind of very subtle verticutting or grooming type of activity in the summertime, that was not going to induce more anthracnose in the turf. It really took a very aggressive, intensifying anthracnose. So we don't. We encourage people not to avoid using these practices if they're needed in terms of thatch reduction and firmness of the putting surface. We think you should be doing things with the caveat that you avoid being too aggressive and try not to do practices that are going to aggressively wound the crown of the plant or be so tightly and closely spaced that you are wounding too much of the turf. And it's really not the wounding, it's probably the stressing out of the turf that's the issue there. So don't avoid these practices. If you got to use them to get the playing conditions you need for your clientele, please do it. Just try not too aggressive with it. Plant growth regulators. We've largely studied the plant growth regulators that are beneficial to Poania, things like Proxy, Primo, and Embark. And I know Embark, unless you have an inventory of it, you're not going to be using it anymore. But all those three growth regulators have been either non-problematic to anthracnose. In other words, they're not increasing anthracnose, or in some cases, they may actually reduce the amount of anthracnose, but it's not a huge effect. And so really for me, the plant growth regulators come down to, do you need to use these things to improve visual quality or playing quality of the turf? And if you do, then by all means use those. I don't think it's a requirement from the standpoint of anthracnose that you use them. But we don't have any strong evidence that those three growth regulators are typically problematic for managing the turf. So if you're using label rate type applications, not doing anything that will stress out the grass, things like Proxy or Embark for seed head control are going to be good. And then Primo Max or Trinexapac ethyl every 7 to 14 days at these kind of rates has been completely adequate and in some cases slightly beneficial. Unfortunately, we have not had the time or the ability to look at things like plaquenil or fluoropirimidol, Cutlass, or Trimit. I suspect that those might be a little different story. We just haven't had the time and ability to look at them. Most people are using those products to actually suppress anthracnose, and hence that's where I have a little bit of reservation. If you're trying to suppress suppress annual bluegrass, you're probably stressing it to do so, and that stress could be problematic when it comes to managing anthracnose. Unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of data on that to share with you, but I would be a little careful with products such as Trimit and Cutlass from the standpoint of anthracnose. Fungicide management. This is really Dr. Clark's area, but I'll summarize the high points here. You really want to avoid repeated sequential use of any fungicide chemistry. So understanding the FRAC codes on your products and making sure you're not filling up one DMI after another. You want to rotate through your materials or tank mix to prevent resistance buildup. So again, tank mixing or pre-mixes or alternating with different fungicide chemistries is going to give you both the best disease control as well as reduce the potential for resistance. So developing programs that focus on the strengths of the fungicide chemistries and the major diseases is what Dr. Clark preaches, and I fully agree with and support. Making sure you're targeting your chemistries appropriately, rotating through your chemistries as best as possible, dictated by what major disease issues you have to focus on your club is the take-home message here. And obviously this is should be obvious, but if rotating through materials, try to use as many chemistries as are practical. You may not be able to use them all, but certainly if there's a chemistry out there that you're not using that you could work into your rotation or your tank mixes, that would be very, very helpful in enhancing your disease control as well as reducing the potential for resistance. And Dr. Clark's emphatic about that. He often gets questioned about what's the perfect program, and he says there are no real perfect programs. What he emphasizes are programs rotate through multiple chemistries are almost always the best programs in suppressing disease. Reliance on single or just a couple of chemistries are programs that often become weak and in a worst case scenario end up developing resistance issues that then cause you great problems when that rears its head. With that, those are my prepared remarks. Sorry for the technological glitches. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully I've shared some ideas with you that can make your job better. Zach, Cameron, be happy to turn it back over to you guys.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. Any questions from the group? I have a question, but any questions from the group as we switch? Hey, Jim, can you stop sharing? Yeah, any questions? Go ahead and unmute your microphone if you have any questions. All right. Hearing none, Jim, I got a question for you. So, can you hear me all right? Dr. Murphy? Maybe we won't have any questions from Zach after all. You gotta love this. Anyway, so I think that'll bring a quick end to those questions. At any rate, so folks, if you have not put it in the chat box, please list and if you're interested, only if you're interested in California pesticide credits, list your last, first, California pesticide license number and email address separated by commas. That would be fabulous. I'll send you a SurveyMonkey quiz, and it'll be for those of you who took the quiz last time, it'll be a really quick quiz for you. And so hopefully we'll get through that pretty quickly. And after you successfully complete the quiz, like Cam said before, you'll get a certificate of completion for your records. And so that's what you'll need for, evidently, for California credits. For those interested in GCS AA points, there's the event code 999-23338-30918. That's the code you will need to go to the GCS AA. And so if you want to take a quick picture of that with your phone or take a snip of it, whatever, that would be great. And if you have any questions at all, please contact me or Cam or Gordon, and we'll make sure to have the get you in touch with the right folks. And here are the upcoming sessions that we have. August 20th, we have Dr. Pat McCullough, herbicide resistance, which is another topic that's becoming a huge issue with polyannua. September 10th, nematodes. October 1st, we have the one and only Dr. Frank Wong talking about regulatory for golf courses. And then October 22nd, Bill Kreuzer and myself will be talking about growth regulators. And so please, if you haven't signed up for California credits yet, again, first, California pesticide license number, email address. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Cameron, Gordon, or myself, Zach Riker. Those are the email addresses. And let us know if you have any questions about the quiz or any of the California pesticide credits. Last chance for questions. Jim Murphy, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I cut out for a little bit. Sorry about that.
I think it's your headphones, I believe. But so, Jim, real quick question for you. We now know that proxy, when we put it down twice in the spring, that was okay for seed head suppression. But if you add the third application in the fall, it suppresses seed heads so much more effectively and consistently. Do you think that that will help to reduce anthracnose in the long run?
My guess is it's going to be beneficial. I haven't studied that, but seed head suppression is something that draws energy away from the plant, the rest of the plant. A lot of carbohydrates have to be partitioned into the seed to get the seeds to develop, and that just robbing from the development of the root system or the development of the shoot system. So that would put that stress on the plant. So any kind of enhancement of seed head or enhancement of seed head suppression should be highly beneficial, in my opinion. Yep. So while I haven't tested that, I would propose that my hypothesis would be it'd be very beneficial.
That's my, again, nobody's really tested that, but that's my my take on it too. Any other questions?
We have 2 questions in the chat. Kelly Halsey would like to know if there's any difference in top dressing with silica sand or calcium carbonate.
So there are major differences in those 2 materials physically as well as chemically. And so if the general rule of thumb is if you have the option to use silica sand, most people would say a silica sand is a better sand to use. It's chemically more inert, and it's also physically more stable. Now, in certain parts of the country, that's difficult to achieve because you would have to truck that in from a long ways away, which makes it a lot more expensive. So sometimes you don't have the choice of a silica versus a sand that contains a significant amount of calcium carbonate. But if you do have the choice, the recommendation is typically stick with a silica sand if you have that choice. I don't know if there's any other aspect to that question you want me to cover, but that's one point of view to think about.
Yeah, Kelly, if you want to unmute, you can. If not, Pat has a question. Does nitrogen source make a difference?
So I did not cover that. Nitrogen source, we thought initially did make a difference. But that work included potassium nitrate versus things like urea, ammonium sulfate. and I think we also use ammonium nitrate. And there was a difference in that study, but it turned out that's what led us to study the potassium issue, because it was the potassium nitrate that kept becoming, showing up as a slightly better nitrogen source. And I glossed over this when I was talking about our sampling technique. It took us a while to figure out what was going on, because we were sampling for potassium, but not seeing any difference in a meaningful way. Obviously, if you're adding more potassium, you should get higher levels, but all the levels were well above what most people would consider optimal levels. And so it wasn't until we started sampling the mat layer, like I talked about in the presentation, that we saw what was happening was the potassium nitrate program was maintaining significantly higher potassium levels in that mat layer, whereas all the other nitrogen programs, we were seeing a significant drop in potassium. So I know I'm answering the question in a long way. It really turned out that it wasn't the nitrogen source that was the difference. It was actually the potassium that was lacking in some nitrogen sources versus the potassium nitrate treatment. It wasn't really the nitrate, it was the potassium content that was impactful. So to our knowledge, nitrogen source doesn't have a big impact. It's really how much you apply and when you apply it. Didn't take the time to talk about it. I emphasized the light, frequent nitrogen programs during the summer, but if you're a granular user and you like to put out modest rates with granular product, for us in our region, we want to use those in the springtime, more so in the fall. And that goes against what is often recommended when people are using granular sources of nitrogen. You often hear about late fall fertility, and it does have its benefits, but when it comes to anthracnose, it's much better to put those granular products out in the spring than it is in the fall.
Okay. Last thing I just wanted to mention as well, I put it into the chat, but if anybody has joined this meeting through our website, that's great. Make sure you bookmark that. The meeting link will go live that morning underneath the heading of the title, and that's where you can also find the recordings as well. And it's, I put it in the meeting link, it's es.bayer.us/sunshine series. So, but also look out for emails. You get them from either My Bayer Rewards or myself or your distributor rep for anything future. Hopefully we see you guys all August 20th. And with that, if there's no more questions, thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, Cam. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for supporting Bayer. Good luck.
Oh, Zach, can you go back to the other slide that we have a question here about GCSAA point?
Oh, sure. Yep, just a second. This is GCSAA points. I'll leave that slide up. I'll leave that slide up for a little bit.